Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest seminar on the Your Essex Community Learning Series. I'm Lee from the Active Essex team, and I'm going to be hosting today's session on legal compliance. So before I introduce Tracy from HR Prime Services, I'll just touch on a quick little bit of housekeeping of how the session today is going to run. So as always with the online learning series, we'll have a presentation followed by the opportunity to ask as many questions as the audience has. Please do be curious and ask Tracy some questions at the end. We will be recording this session as well, and it will be made available on the Your Essex Community YouTube channel, so you can revisit it at another time. You can share it with colleagues and with your partners and other people in your network that you think the session today will be of interest to. If you're attending this session live, you'll receive a follow-up email along with that YouTube link and other Your Essex community resources. So Tracy, if you wouldn't mind just going on to the next slide, please. Just to say that this online learning series is part of the wider Your Essex community support offer. And if this is your first touch point with Your Essex community, Your Essex community is about supporting the voluntary and community sector across Essex, really hoping to create conditions that enable charities, community groups and social enterprises thrive. We want to be able to provide quality support and access to a range of different topics. And the intention is also to support the voluntary and community sector to navigate challenges independently, connect with their peers, strengthen their resilience, and pick up some key skills and learning opportunities like we'll have with Tracy today. The offer is ever evolving, but there are three main elements. So next slide, please, Tracy. It all starts with an e-portal, so a one-stop shop with lots of different resources, information, advice, guidance on a range of different topics that are relevant to the sector. So on that website, there's lots of hints and tips and support around governance, trustees, decision making, safeguarding, volunteer management, and latest news and blogs. So please do check that out beyond today. Next slide, please, Tracy. There is a community of practice around community participation. So this is all about supporting voluntary sector organisations to share learning, to work together around how is it that they best support communities in their programming of their activities. So this is really about how that work strategically supports to create a culture that really values and empowers active and engaged communities. So there's a QR code on there to be able to tap into some of that work. And then finally, there is a place-based support offer, which thank you. So this is all about building capacity and capability locally in voluntary sector organisations. As part of this offer, there's local training, events, learning opportunities that really understands the local needs from the voluntary sector and how best kind of the place-based support offer can help organisations at kind of district and place offer. So that work for the year ahead is currently being developed, and we'll be able to share some more information of some of the activities that are available at place beyond today's session too. So back to today, I would like to welcome Tracy Salisbury, who is leading today's session. Tracy is the Director of HR Prime Services, who's worked in HR for over 20 years and worked in multiple sectors, including banking, charity, government, and consultancy. And today, Tracy's going to provide an overview of legal considerations when employing staff and volunteers, and we'll also cover areas such as the law, upcoming legal challenges, best practice, different management styles, and give you some top tips on how to motivate your workforce too. So plenty to get our teeth into this afternoon. Tracy, welcome.
Thanks, Lee.
I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, everyone. It's quite a detailed topic, as Lee said. There's lots to run through with you, and it's one of those topics that we could talk about every single aspect of this for hours on their own. So it is a bit of a run through. It's lots of information in not very much time. So please do ask any questions that you've got, or if you need any clarification of anything at all at the end. So just to give an overview of kind of SMEs in the UK, make up 99.9% of businesses in the country. So a really high number of businesses that employ under 250 staff and fall into that category of being a small medium enterprise. Obviously, that also includes charities, as some of yourselves will be from charities that employ paid staff as well as volunteers. So as an employer, your staff are looking for 7 key things from you, which is job security, fair processes, training and development, some things around pay, reward and benefits. And obviously, if you're employing volunteers, then the paid element won't apply, but the others potentially will. Progression and opportunities. So everybody, whether they're paid or voluntary, wants to be learning and gaining something from what they do. Concern for physical and mental health, which is becoming a growing concern, as some of you may be aware of, and for you to work within the law and best practice as a company. So obviously today's topic is talking about legal compliance. And if we were going to summarise legal compliance in one sentence, it's what protects your business and protects your people. So the areas that make you a good place to work and mean that your staff have a good place to go to for their work or for their experience. Now, a quick checklist when you're employing paid staff particularly, but some of these may apply to volunteers as well. So the things that you need to do to be compliant with the law, obviously to make sure you pay minimum wage, and we'll talk a little bit later about what those rates are. A really, really important one that is very easy to overlook, but very expensive if you don't comply with the law, is make sure you're checking right to work in the UK for all of your staff. It's a really quick check. There's government guidelines, government documents to kind of talk you through how to do it. It should literally take you minutes, but like we say, the fines for not complying are really, quite large and very detrimental to yourselves as a business. Make sure you follow any statutory requirements. So things like if you need a DBS check, all of your insurances. If you're employing paid staff who are going to be employed for more than a month, they need to have a written statement of employment on or before their first day of employment. Now, you can send them out a shortened version of that and follow up with the full document within a couple of months. We tend to say people just send the document. It's one less thing to remember, and make sure you get that out to the staff before they start. Obviously, think about any HMRC or any pension requirements. If you've got 5 or more staff, your health and safety policy needs to be written down. And again, that's something people often overlook, or you may forget to include people like directors into your staff numbers. So just make sure that if you hit that number, that policy is written. And alongside that policy will be lots of other health and safety processes. So things like accident reporting, rider reporting, just make sure that if something happens that you do follow the law on those. And then finally is around your UK GDPR responsibilities. So looking at things like data protection, subject access requests, safeguarding, and all of those kind of areas. So a very quick checklist there. Like I said, we won't go into detail on each of these points, but if anybody has got any questions on them, please do ask us at the end. So just to put into context, trustee and volunteer numbers in the UK. So as at January this year, there were 922,002 trustees registered in the UK and over 6.5 million volunteers. So massive numbers of you that are working in the voluntary sector in those roles. And it's estimated that at any one time, over half of charities are actively looking for trustees. So those numbers are only likely to grow as time goes on. Now, what is a trustee? Obviously, we may have some trustees amongst us who hopefully know what you do and what your role is. But overall, the trustees have control of the charity and are responsible for making sure that it's doing what it was set up to do. Now, trustees may be called other titles such as directors, board members, governors, committee members, but whatever you call them, their responsibilities are the same in that they lead the charity, they make decisions that very often impact on people's lives. And as a trustee, you're very likely to be making a difference to your local community, to wider society or to individuals. So a really, really needed and really valued role. Trustees bring lots of different skills and experiences to support the charity, and you will use those skills and experiences to help the charity to achieve their aims. But as we said earlier, you're also very likely to learn new skills as a trustee as well. So something you may personally get from being a trustee might be learning different skills and different, different aspects of that role. Charities Commission, as you know, are the overall body who maintain the Register of Charities in England and Wales. And that gives the public the confidence to support charities, that they're registered, that they are who they say they are, and that they have the registration and the backing of the Charities Commission. So the work that you do will always be in accordance with the Charities Commission's requirements and guidelines. Now, I'm going to talk you through briefly now the Employment Rights Bill, which I'm sure you've all heard of. It's had a lot of media attention. To a certain extent, it was a lot of the manifesto of the Labour government before they were elected as to what they proposed to do with work. Now, a lot of these changes have come in this month, and the rest of them are planned to come in over the next year or so. So we'll give you a quick run through of kind of what the changes are and how you need to prepare for those. Again, like we say, it is a brief overview, so do let us know if there's any questions on them. Some of these changes have already come in, so they come in December. And that is a change to paternity leave relating to bereavement. So if a mother or adopted mother dies within childbirth or within a year, the surviving parent can take additional parental leave or paternity leave. Like we said, that change has already come in. And the other change that's already come in is some changes to early conciliation through ACAS. So if you have a member of staff who approaches ACAS to say they're not happy with their treatment and they're considering taking legal action against you, ACAS will commence a process which is called early conciliation. Now, previously they had 6 weeks to negotiate and to conciliate with yourselves, and that is now 12 weeks. So that's the period of time from when the staff member contacts them to when either a resolution is reached or a tribunal certificate is issued, and that has doubled. Now, there's some bigger changes that have taken place this month, which you may well have heard about with statutory sick pay. This is one of the biggest concerns that we're hearing from our clients is around the impact that this change is having on businesses, on charities. So there's 2 big changes to SSP in April, and they both come in on the 6th. So these are already in place. The first is that the 3 unpaid waiting days have been removed. So statutory sick pay is now payable from day 1 of absence. And the other change is that in order to qualify for statutory sick pay, previously staff had to earn £125 a week. That limit has now been removed. So statutory sick pay is payable from day 1, and it is paid at either the rate of SSP, which is £123.25 a week, or 80% of wages. And it's paid at the lower of the 2. So in reality for yourselves, that means that your budgeting now needs to include an additional 3 pays of SSP for anybody, but it also needs to include potentially 80% of wages for staff who previously didn't qualify for any pay at all that would have been unpaid. So a really, really big change for organisations and a big impact financially. Now, in order to be able to manage this change, it's really important that you're managing absence and that you're managing attendance. And there's lots of ways you can do that through things like return to work interviews, considering wellness and well-being within the workplace, making sure people are following absence recording processes, and also making sure you're keeping data so you can identify if people are off at high levels or if they're off on particular days, if they're hitting any triggers. But without having the data, it will be really hard to manage the absence. So that's one of the first changes that has happened. Another big change that's coming in April is previously workers could only qualify for paternity leave, family leave, after they'd worked with you for 6 months. This is now a day 1 right. So from day 1 of employment, people can take parental leave or paternity leave. They still don't get paid, but they have the right to the time off from day 1 of employment. And then another really big change, which has already come in last week, is the Fair Work Agency. So some of you may have heard of the Fair Work Agency on the news. They are a government body who have got the right to visit and audit properties and premises and businesses. They come into effect on the 7th of April. They don't need to have a reason to visit you, so they won't be visiting on the back of a complaint. It can just be random audits and inspections. And they will be able to look at things like your records, your data, and your compliance with the law. And if you're found to have breached that, they will have the right to issue fines and sanctions immediately. The other really interesting thing that they will be able to do is to take employers to tribunal on the workers' behalf. So even if your employee doesn't want to take tribunal action against you, the Fair Work Agency will have the authority to do that. So it's really, really important that your records and your documents are in order, because if you do get audited, they will want to see them there and then. Some other changes that have happened in April is changes to minimum wage, which obviously is no surprise because it happens every year. But we've just popped on the screen what the new rates are. There's some other changes going on around redundancy awards and trade unions, which we won't go massively into detail today because they probably won't affect a lot of you, but obviously they are all on the slides for you to have a read. There is a really big change to whistleblowing, which is also detailed in there. So for those of you who may use settlement agreements or non-disclosure agreements to protect yourselves from claims around harassment and sexual harassment, this will now be outlawed. And staff will always be able to speak up about harassment or discrimination. And the other real change is that sexual harassment is going to become a whistleblowing protection. So at the moment, sexual harassment is just dealt with internally as a kind of grievance issue. But under these new laws, it will become a whistleblowing protection, which gives staff greater rights to take action against you on that. Now, there's some more changes planned for October. The biggest change in October is that the tribunal time limits will be extended. So at the moment, staff have 3 months minus 1 day to take you to tribunal. That will extend to 6 months. So on top of the ACAS period doubling, the tribunal time limits are also increasing. So potentially from the point of somebody leaving to the point that they issue their tribunal notice could be 9 months, which is quite a long time when you're managing those cases. And then some more changes to sexual harassment, some more changes to trade unions. And for those of you that work in hospitality or with tipping, there's some quite big changes to tipping laws coming in October as well. So do read through those on the slides. Like I say, if you've got any questions, let us know and we can cover them at the end. And then going forward into 2027, there's some more changes to come. So the really big one, which I'm sure most of you will have heard about in one form or another, is the unfair dismissal periods. At the moment, you have 2 years where you can relatively safely terminate a contract. There are exceptions to that where it's related to things like a protected characteristic or health and safety or whistleblowing. But generally speaking, you've got 2 years before somebody can claim unfair dismissal. That's going to be 6 months on the 1st of January next year. So anybody who is employed by you on or before July of this year will claim their unfair dismissal rights on the 1st of January. We've got a slide on the next screen which explains that a little bit clearer. But if you have any staff who you are planning to terminate employment, you need to think about this period of time. And you also need to think about your probation periods and processes going forwards to make sure that if you are terminating, you've got evidence and you've got documentation. There's some changes to bereavement leave where it will extend beyond child bereavement and it will become bereavement leave for dependents or for close contacts. And there's also lots of changes to fire and rehire. So for those of you who may try and consult on contract changes and not reach an agreement, it will be a lot harder to implement those changes. So as we said, there's a quick slide there which just covers the unfair dismissal rights, which shows that anybody who has already started work or is employed up to the 1st of July this year will gain their unfair dismissal rights on the 1st of January. So remember, if there's anybody on probation where you have any concerns with performance at all, those 6 months will include notice. So you really need to be making decisions on suitability for employment, ideally after 3 months of probation. So again, just sort of be aware of those coming and let us know if you need any clarification. There are some other changes going on behind the scenes which are very likely to come in, which include changes to contracts, to worker status, menopause reporting, some more changes to bereavement leave. So lots of other things that inevitably will come up over the next year or so. But that's kind of an overview of where we are at the moment with the Employment Rights Bill changes. So how can you prepare for them? Review your policies and procedures. As we said earlier, think about your processes, think about your return to work interviews, your probation reviews, your one-to-ones. Really, really think about your documentation and how you monitor trends and how you manage that. Consider managers training. You know, are your managers or the people on the front line equipped to be dealing with this? Do they understand the rules? Do they understand the law? Try and keep yourselves up to date with the changes. Obviously, that's a very hard thing to do sometimes when they're changing so quickly, but we will talk at the end about how you can seek information and be proactive. You know, we always say to people, if you've got a question, even if you think it's a silly question, ask it while it is a silly question before it becomes a big issue. You know, you don't need to be experts on all of this because there's so much going on so quickly, but just know where you can get your information from. How will it impact tribunal cases? I mean, inevitably it will. They're expecting a 17% increase in tribunal claims off of the back of these changes. We actually saw some cases yesterday that are being scheduled for tribunals now till 2030. So I think it's very clear that the tribunal is going to see a big increase in cases. Something that isn't going to help that in a good way at all is that the unfair dismissal limit is currently capped at 12 months' pay or £118,223. From January, that unfair dismissal limit will be removed, which means unfair dismissal cases in tribunal will be completely uncapped. So on top of all of the other changes and all of the other rights, staff may feel that they have more to gain by going to tribunal now that limits are uncapped, which again inevitably will push tribunal numbers up. The only exceptions to that will continue to be whistleblowing or health and safety claims previously, but they are now also removed. So there will be no cap on any unfair dismissal awards in tribunals from next year. So quite a lot to take in there. I appreciate I've given you a lot of information quite quickly. Just some stats to kind of look at how that is affecting business. So 79% of employers, which also includes charities, are expecting expenses to rise. 30% of companies have said they will be reducing headcount through redundancy, with 17% potentially cutting staff hours. So that came out of a CIPD survey last year. The FSB, Federation of Small Business, have found similar. So in their survey, 33% were expecting to reduce numbers. 51% feel that their labour costs are their biggest barrier to growing. And 67% feel that they will actually curb hiring due to these changes and these legislation changes. So I don't know how that kind of compares with your own businesses, your own charities, and whether they're kind of trends that you're also seeing. But certainly across the UK, that's what's sort of anticipated to happen. So workforce challenges for yourselves as charities, there was a recent study which showed that charities that rely on a shadow workforce. Now, these are people who use their volunteers to do roles which are absolutely critical to the running of your charity. And those shadow workforces say that it's been an increase of 16% in the last 12 months. So charities are actually more and more finding that you need to rely on your volunteer workforce to deliver the services because perhaps the funding isn't there to fund that through routes that you would have used in the past. Now, 61% of charities feel that they're likely or very likely to reduce workforces, with 80% exploring cost cutting. Interestingly, around volunteer roles, and this kind of shows the shift perhaps in the workforce over the last few years, remote volunteer roles have increased by 12%, with on-site increasing by 20%. So there is certainly a trend of people wanting to get back into kind of face-to-face work, and that face-to-face element is growing quicker than its remote roles. However, when you're advertising jobs, remote volunteer jobs are getting 4 times as many applications as on-site roles. So some really interesting stats there around how people want to work and perhaps how charities as well as businesses have had to evaluate how work can be done differently. You know, are there roles that can now be done remotely that in the past you wouldn't have even been able to consider? So just a quick question there as to, does that reflect your own experience? Obviously, I don't expect you to answer it, but just think about, you know, have you seen changes in your own charities over the last 12 months, over the last 3 years, 5 years that perhaps you wouldn't have anticipated seeing? Now, there's just a real quick model here to talk you through. So when any organisation, any person goes through change, it follows a process, which is something that was defined by somebody called Tuckman. And it says that you always start off in your forming stage, which is where you're forming relationships, you're forming a way of working. Something then changes, which throws you into storming. Everything's up in the air, people aren't quite finding their place, you know, there's perhaps resistance or uncertainty. Once that settles down, you go into what's called norming, which is where it's business as normal. Everybody's doing their job. People will then start to settle into those new roles, those new opportunities, and actually perform. But then something changes again and it throws it all back to the beginning. And I think in any business, you know, whether you are a charity, you know, a commercial business, whether you're a trustee yourself or a volunteer or an employee, you can kind of see in that pattern how change is inevitable. And the really important thing with change is how, as a manager or a leader, you deal with that and you support your staff through it. And there's a quick slide here on the 6 responsibilities of a trustee, which has come from the Charity Care Commission. So your first responsibility is purpose. So to make sure your charity is carrying out its purpose for the public benefit. Governance, so making sure you comply with your governing documents and any relevant law. Acting in your charity's best interests, so making sure the interests of the charity are followed. Resources, and managing your charity's resources responsibly, whether they're financial resources, whether they're staff resources. Care and skill, so yourself as a trustee or as a leader of that charity, acting with reasonable care and skill and making use of your own skills and experiences. And then accountability, so making sure the charity is accountable and making sure you comply with any statutory requirements. So that's an overview of your responsibilities as a trustee or as a leader of those charities. Obviously, they're defined by the Charity Commission for the charity sector, but they align very nicely with the responsibilities of a leader in a business as well, you know, in the public or private sector. So when you take on any kind of leadership role, just think about those things, you know, whether you're sort of fulfilling them and how you do them as part of your normal day. And then something that's really important as a kind of underlying message of all of this is developing your staff. Now, whether they're paid staff or voluntary staff, everybody comes to work for a reason. And sometimes opening up those communications with people about what they want, how do they want to perform, what are their priorities can be really important. So a few ways that you can do that is through appraisals and one-to-ones. You might want to do a training needs analysis of the business, so to look at what skills you have and what skills you're likely to need going forwards. You might want to talk about this in your interviews and as part of your recruitment. And very often it comes out of action planning and succession planning. So looking forward as to not only what do we need now, but what will we need in the future, you know, and who are the suitable people to do that. Something that's very common that we talk quite about a lot in management is accidental managers. So it'll be interesting to know if any of yourselves consider yourself an accidental manager. An accidental manager is defined as somebody who has been promoted without necessarily having the training or resources to do so. So very often you fall into a management or a leadership role without necessarily having the background or the skills or the training. And that can have a really big impact on the business. As we see here, 40% of staff that were interviewed don't think their manager is trained enough. And when you're thinking about your own businesses, your own teams, your own management teams, and as we said earlier with attendants, you know, very often they're the people on the front line that are managing those incoming queries and that are very much the face of the organisation. And sometimes it's really important to kind of ask yourself as a leadership team, are they trained enough? You know, do they understand their responsibilities? Are they equipped and confident to deal with the things they might be managing? And if they're not, think about training. You know, as we saw there, leadership training can often lead to up to a 20% increase in retention. You know, it's a very quick win. Sometimes people are sort of hesitant to train because there is a cost involved, but often it can be less than the cost of losing good people. And when you are managing, you know, when you are a leader, a really good quote there that I really like is a boss has a title, the leader has the people. You know, anybody can call themselves a boss, but can you actually lead the teams? Can you instill that confidence in them? We use something which some of you might have heard of called DISC, personality profiling or behaviour profiling. And what DISC looks at is where your behaviour preferences sit across 4 colours. So red is your dominance, you know, how dominant are you? How much do you look for results? How much are you motivated by results? The yellow, is a bit more around the influence. You know, are you somebody that loves to interact with others? Are you naturally drawn to people? Are you a natural communicator? Your greens like steadiness, so like stability, perhaps a bit slower paced, like to know what's happening, to have a plan. And then the blue section is around compliance, so facts, analysis, critical thinking, looking at data. And we very often say to people, sometimes understanding your own profile as a leader is really, really important. But perhaps more important is understanding your teams. How do you motivate them? If you've got somebody in your team that's very, very red, they will be motivated by you setting them a task. But equally, if you've got somebody who's not very yellow at all, they're not going to be motivated by you putting them into situations with a lot of socialization or where they feel quite uncomfortable. So sometimes understanding your own behavior profile, but also those around you, can really help with things like communication and conflict management and relationship building. And then on to diversity now. So obviously in the current world, in the current climate, you will be managing diverse workforces, and it's more or less inevitable that you will be managing those who have disability, neurodiversity, who may suffer with their mental health, women who are going through menopause, and perhaps those who are a younger worker or of a different ethnicity and race. And whether that's people that you're managing or yourself and your own requirements, it's really important to understand how you can get the best out of these diverse groups. And there's a slide here which shows the protected characteristics. So when we talk about protected characteristics in law, there are 9 areas that are defined as protected characteristics. And that is your age, your sexual orientation, your sex in terms of gender, religion and belief, race, pregnancy and maternity, marriage or civil partnership, gender reassignment or disability. Now, when we talk about some areas, as we did a moment ago, like menopause, for example, doesn't fall into any of those categories. But if somebody were to claim discrimination for menopause, they will almost certainly be claiming under sex discrimination and age discrimination. So just think when you're managing people, obviously this list is the official list that people can make claims under, but many categories, many different things can fall into these without being blatantly obvious. Now, when we're looking at discrimination, there's different types of discrimination that can occur. So direct discrimination is very obvious who you are discriminating against. So if you put out an advert that says a young lady is required for Saturday, a young lady is required to join our team, you are very directly discriminating against older people or non-female people. The indirect discrimination is often a bit more subtle. So you might put something out to say a person is required to join our team to work every Sunday, or to work between 8 and 9 every morning. Now, indirectly, that potentially could discriminate against religious groups. It could discriminate against females doing a school run. Now, that doesn't mean you can't advertise that job, but you do need to think about whether you can justify it. The job that you've advertised from 8 to 9 in the morning, could it actually be done 9 till 10 in the morning once the children are dropped at school? If it's essential that that's the only time the job can be done, then it's absolutely fine, to advertise it, but just think about your justification. Discrimination by association or associative discrimination is where somebody is treated differently because of somebody that they know or associated with who is protected under the Equality Act. Now, very often this comes out of banter claims, lots of banter in the workplace about women or women's role in society. Now, it may be an all-male team and nobody in the team is directly offended, but they will all be associated with a woman, whether it's through a spouse, a parent, a sibling. And those people could be offended and could be discriminated against by association. And then vicarious liability at the bottom is the one that we most often talk about at Christmas. It's where the companies can be held liable for the acts of their employees. The other place this often comes up is in interviews. And we'll talk in a moment about unconscious bias. But if you had an interview panel where potentially the interviewer made a comment that was discriminatory, we very often it comes up around pregnancy, for example, are you planning to start a family in the next few years? That might not be the views of your company and it might not be the question of your company, but that manager is representing you and the company could be held vicariously liable through that question. So those are different types of discrimination. Just a few quick stats here as just to put into context what we're talking about. So 1 in 4 working age adults are disabled. And currently at work in the UK, there are 5.1 million disabled people who are working. 78% of neurodivergent workers have reported to regularly feeling overwhelmed at work. And the stats around mental ill health are quite similar. 1 in 4 adults will or are experiencing mental ill health at some point in their working life. And it's currently defined as the most common cause of work limiting conditions amongst aged 44 and under. And with menopause, nearly 8 out of 10 or 80% of women will go through menopause whilst they're in employment, with 67% of that feeling that it affects their work. Now, for those of you that are employing staff, these figures are really important because inevitably, if you look at the size of your workforces, you probably will be employing people in these categories. For those of you who are employing volunteers, potentially you have volunteers who are volunteering with you because of ill health, because of mental ill health or disability. And it's really important, even though volunteers can't take action under employment tribunals or under unfair dismissal, from a reputational point of view and a management point of view, it's really important that you manage fairly and that you have processes in place to support your staff and your volunteers. Just a really quick slide here, which kind of sums up the previous screen. So we talked to lots of companies that say, well, everything's fine. You know, we know that we're treating people fairly because we treat them all the same. And sometimes when you look at these graphics, it just highlights that people don't necessarily need to be treated the same. You know, if this company had given every member of staff 2 blocks, the first person is still tall and the small person is still small. So it's much fairer to look at what they need individually and to adapt your support and your adjustments to meet the individual's need. And don't fall in the trap of thinking, well, I've got 3 people in my team with a certain condition, therefore they all need the same. Because everybody will need something different. And it's really important to talk to that individual and understand their own requirements. Psychological contracts, just a really quick slide on this one. This is the contract that's never written down. So when you take somebody on, you'll issue them a contract of employment or you'll issue them a volunteer agreement that sets out all of the things that you offer and all of the things you do and why it's good to work for your company or volunteer for your charity. The psychological contract are the bits that are kind of the underlying, the unwritten rule. So you could do the best induction in the world with your new starter, but when they go off at lunchtime and they sit in the staff room and their colleagues are saying, oh, this is a terrible place to work, or my manager never does any one-to-ones, or, you know, we never get paid on time, that psychological contract will undo all the good that you do through your written documents. And it's really important to think about how actions are interpreted and how things that the staff or the other volunteers say can have an impact on either on your new recruits or on your current workforce. So just think as a leadership team or a trustee team, how do you make sure that the workforce are happy? And how do you make sure that these niggles and these kind of underlying concerns don't affect that psychological contract? Whether it's with volunteers, with supporters, you know, with members of the public, but anything that can kind of damage your reputation. Now, obviously, anybody volunteering has different motivations, and exactly the same way as paid staff have different motivations for coming to work. So some of you may have heard of these in the past. People will either be intrinsically motivated, which means they're driven by making a difference. They act in alignment with charity's mission. Very often people volunteer for a charity because they have a personal connection with the cause or a personal desire to support the cause. And they want to feel good. They want to feel part of something. Their kind of satisfaction and their sense of worth comes from intrinsic elements. Other people are very extrinsically motivated, which means they might be motivated by pay. They might be motivated by pay rises. They might have a very clear set of skills that they want to come in. They want to learn these skills, and that's their motivation. These people very often like a bit more clarity. They might like to have a defined role or a defined job description, or they might be with you for a fixed amount of time and then they move on. And when you're looking at motivation, it's really important to remember there is no right or wrong. You know, you need a bit of everybody within your team. And as we looked at with the DISC profile in a moment ago, you know, you need somebody that falls into every colour. And you need a mixture of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. The trick for yourselves as managers and leaders is understanding what motivates people and then how can you get the best out of them. So why does motivation matter for charities? When somebody's giving you their time for free, very often there are certain underlying expectations, which is they want to be put into a role that meets their values, meets their goals. They want to be communicated in a way that feels meaningful to them. They want, or as a company, you want to increase satisfaction and retention, but your volunteers also want to feel valued. And doing things like onboarding or catch-up meetings can give you a really good opportunity to reconnect their values. You know, look at, are they still feeling valued? Are they still gaining out of what they're doing? Sometimes with volunteers, and when we looked at the change cycle a moment ago, that can be really hard because sometimes your volunteers have their own very strong beliefs around how they would like things to be done or how you're spending money, for example. And having those regular catch-ups where you can kind of talk to them and recognise what they're doing and say thank you, can be so, so important. And as we say, that also applies to paid staff as well. It's really important just to say thank you and recognise what people have done. Some of the challenges that are faced by the voluntary sector at the moment. So finance, funding is obviously very competitive. Budgets are very limited. We're in a difficult financial climate. There is an increased demand for services. And as we saw earlier, in some cases, that is resulting in volunteers doing roles that are way over and above either what they feel they should be doing or what the charity ideally would like them to be doing. And there is a real risk of burnout. Mental ill health is on the rise. There is a real risk that people, especially when they're volunteering, feel that they can't say no. And you need to be able to manage that as a leader to make sure that you're not overusing people's goodwill. And the same with trustees. Very often you may find that as a trustee, you're called into day-to-day operations as well as the trustee element that you're actually there for. And it's really important to kind of have an awareness of that and make it okay for people to say no. Just a quick slide here on listening skills. So some of you may have seen this before, but there's a study by Professor Albert Mehrabian, and he has put together a study a long time ago in the 60s around how the spoken language is interpreted. Now, this study shows that out of everything you say, only 7% of the message that somebody takes comes from your words. 38% comes from your tone, 55% comes from your body language. So just something to think about if you are communicating perhaps difficult news or something, concerning within the charity and you're conveying those difficult messages, make sure you're thinking about your tone and your body language as well as the spoken words, because they're actually much more important in terms of getting your message across. And then we mentioned earlier unconscious bias. So unconscious biasness exists in all of this. And they're formed throughout life through beliefs or through your views that may come from your experiences. Unconscious bias can occur where you might think better of somebody because you like something about them or you can see a similarity, but equally you might think less of somebody because of this bias. And often that does mean that you can make decisions which are influenced by false assumptions, stereotyping. Now, when you're looking at things like recruitment and management, it's really, really important to be aware of your unconscious bias and to make sure it doesn't affect decisions that you make at work. So some of the things that unconscious bias could be seen at in your own kind of companies would be only socialising with people who are similar to yourselves, not hiring somebody because they have a tattoo or they have body piercings, even if it doesn't affect their role, your bias may tell you that's not okay. Choosing to hire somebody because you're attracted to them. And that doesn't necessarily mean physically attracted, but it could be that stereotype that we need a really attractive member of staff on reception. Or, we can't have this member of staff on reception because they have a tattoo and it will offend people. So it can come from any of those areas. Placing more value on someone's opinion because they're a friend or because you feel that you trust them because they're in a position of responsibility. Not including people in meetings because you don't like them personally, or not inviting somebody to a team building event because you're worried, for example, their disability might mean they can't take part. And it's really important as managers and leaders to challenge our unconscious bias and to think about how it may affect our decisions and how you can minimise that, through your everyday business. So 5 top tips just to summarise kind of what we've said. So ensure that you meet with others, talk to others, stay up to date with legal requirements, make sure you meet the legal requirements. It's one thing to know about them, it's another thing to implement them. The law generally changes in April or October, although obviously it's not guaranteed, but generally that's when employment law changes will come in. Get your processes, your policies, your procedures in place and follow them when you're making decisions. Train your managers, really think about how you can cascade this information to your leaders and make sure they're confident. And probably the most important one of today is you don't have to be an expert in everything. There's places that you can get HR advice from, which we'll look at in a moment. Like I say, networking is really important. Using some of the resources that Lee spoke about earlier through the portals, you don't need to know all of this yourself. There's resources out there to help you. When you're managing volunteers, have yourselves a volunteer quick checklist. So make sure you've got a volunteer policy. Make sure you explain that you don't pay for time, only reimbursement. Make sure you keep claims forms and receipts and make it clear that there's no obligation on the volunteer to work set hours, and avoid language in those agreements that implies a contract of employment. There has been some case law that's gone through the courts recently, which you might have heard of, where volunteers have claimed that actually they have employment status, because they are indeed paid. So just try and make sure that all of that is clear up front before you recruit somebody. And as we say, if you are considering any other payment, just seek some HR or some legal advice. Make sure it doesn't put yourselves at risk. And then where can you seek advice? So we've talked about the fact you can seek it. There's lots of free advice out there. ACAS and Gov UK are the main places to go to for this kind of advice. There is things like networking. There's obviously a lot of professional support through Active Essex, your Essex community, through your local councils. So there's a lot of support out there. There obviously are HR consultancies like ourselves. We have a mailing list, which if anybody would like to join, it's completely free, and we just send out legal updates as and when they arise. So have a look where the advice is. But like I say, remember, you don't need to be an expert. It's much better to look for the advice as you need it, and deal with that, as and when it arises. So final slide, on behalf of your Essex community, if you would be happy to scan the QR code that's on screen, it will also be sent round in the slides that Lee will cascade. Receiving feedback on events like this obviously make sure that the content is being delivered that's helpful to you, and also lets Lee kind of evaluate the success of the sessions. So I'll leave that slide up in a moment, and then I'll pop my slide up with my details as well. Again, obviously they will come round on the slides, and we'll do a Q&A in a moment. But if there's anything else at all that you need clarified, please do let us know. Lee, anything else at all you want to cover?
Just to say, Tracy, thank you very much for expertly navigating us through that session there. I think that was almost like a topic a minute, but I certainly learned a hell of a lot through that session. I will offer the opportunity for any questions in the chat. So please, just while we do have the next kind of 10 minutes available, please do pop any questions you do have in the chat. Tracy, I was actually going to ask a question around employment law and then where that feeds into kind of volunteers. So, but I think you sort of like done that right at the end there really well. Yeah. So I just wanted to check on kind of where's the crossover between employment law, and you were talking around the protected characteristics and things like that. How does that feed into how potentially people on the call or listening, or charities who have volunteers that do work either through an agreement or even potentially casual volunteers as well? Where's the kind of, where does that cross over?
I mean, the really important thing for yourselves, I would say, is to get your agreements in place. So have a contract of employment for paid staff. And we would recommend to have a volunteer agreement for your volunteers, which sets out quite clearly what the expectations are for you and for them. And like we say, if you are reimbursing things like expenses, it's really important to document what they're entitled to. So volunteers don't traditionally have the right to take you to an employment tribunal. So it's a different kind of recourse with a volunteer, in terms that, you wouldn't be taken, they wouldn't take legal action against you as a paid member of staff would. But obviously all of the associated risks that go with that, like obviously the injury to feelings for the volunteer, the reputational damage that comes from it, all of those things still exist. So it's really important that you do still manage fairly and still be aware of the risks, still make the adjustments. And I think one of the really key things there, as we said earlier, is understanding people's motivation to volunteer. They may have their own needs or their own kind of adjustments that they need you to make. And I think understanding those in order that you can then accommodate them is really important.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Tracy. And actually, I think quite a lot of the kind of content today was really refreshing around kind of leadership styles and how we can support our volunteer and paid for workforces too, as well. So some really good tips, I think, for volunteer managers as well in charities as well. So hopefully some takeaways, as well as some legal compliance stuff around our day-to-day practice of how we're managing our people, and amazing volunteers that give up their time to support our communities too. So thank you very much. I will, you mentioned you have a mailing list, yes, which gives some updates and things. So as part of the follow-up from today's session, I'll take that off you, Tracy, and we'll make sure we get that out to those who have been with us on the call today.
Yeah, that's fine.
And was there anything else that you'd just like to close on before I don't think we've had any questions in the chat. So any final points from you?
No, I think just to kind of reiterate that, you know, in all of this, there's no right or wrong. And I think the most important thing you can do as a manager or a leader, or when you're running any business or charity, is to understand what your staff need. You know, what are your people asking you for? Like we say, look at what motivates them. Why are they here? And avoid that kind of temptation, I guess, to fit into one size fits all. You know, as we saw on the equality slide with the blocks, don't fall into the risk of saying, well, every one of my volunteers needs this, and therefore that's what I'm going to give them, because it actually might not be. And I think just taking the time to, you know, to understand why people are there and to thank them for what they give can really go a long way.
Brilliant. Great bookend there. Amazing. Thank you very much, Tracy. Just to say to everyone on the call, thank you very much for participating this afternoon and giving up your time. As I said, this session's been recorded and it will be placed on a YouTube channel, and we'll get the link back out to you. Oh, we have had one final question actually. So Tracy, so lots of charities have short-term funding which leads to fixed-term contracts which are then rolled over when funding is renewed.
Yeah.
So given the reduction in time for people to get unfair dismissal protection, even when people are on short-term fixed terms, that need to be taken through a fair process, even if that's not renewed. Should we give people open-ended contracts rather than continually rolling them over on fixed terms?
It's a really good question, and I think it's a real consideration for the charity sector. In terms of the law, they will hit their 6 months unfair dismissal, regardless of whether that's hit through 2 or 3 continuous short-term contracts or 1 long-term. So I would say the decision as to what contract you put them on probably depends on your funding. If you know it is only 6 months funding, you may as well put them on a 6-month contract. But the important thing is going to be having those meetings towards the end of that contract to explain that it's coming to an end, why it's coming to an end, you know, what that means for the charity. I guess something to consider behind the scenes is if you do have somebody who is continually employed on short-term contracts, but they then hit 2 years service, they will be entitled to redundancy pay. And some of those other areas. So it might be a budgeting conversation as to how you manage the kind of financial risks of it. But I think the actual contract itself would be defined by the funding and what that sort of availability is.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tracy. Do you think, just while we're on that subject, do you think commissioners and grant givers are kind of really up to speed with the changes that are happening here and some of the challenges that were just raised in the chat?
You would hope so. I mean, I think inevitably it does affect how charities will manage their staff. I think the difficulty in the charity sector is the funding is always going to be limited, and it's probably always going to be short term. So I think the responsibility is always going to lie with the charity in terms of managing that and managing the termination. But I certainly think there may be support that could be given at that higher level and for people then managing it. The other really big change under the law, as we kind of alluded to earlier, is at the moment, under 2 year service, you don't need to give a reason for termination. You know, you, as long as your contract allows and there's no other factors, you can literally just say to somebody, this isn't working out, we're ending your contract. Once the 6 month comes in, it's very anticipated that you will have to have a reason and documentation and to be able to justify why you're terminating that contract. So with something like the question that came up in the chat a moment ago, you know, having it detailed in the contract that it's a fixed term role, this is the end date, you know, is going to be really important.
Brilliant. Superb advice. Thank you very much. And thank you for the question. I believe that is us done. So just to say, unless there's anything else that pops up through, a massive thank you, Tracy, for steering us through that session. Really helpful advice, and hopefully that recording will be useful for people to go back and forward to and share with colleagues as well beyond today. Some rounds of applause is coming through soon as well, so thank you for everyone. I'll close this session to say thank you very much. Hope everyone has a good rest of the day, and we'll send out the information to you all soon.
Thank you. Thanks for attending, and thanks, Lee, for the opportunity.
Thank you lot. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Tracy.